It was an ordinary Tuesday at Paws and Play, the local pet daycare, when a tiny, spirited pup named Toby remained unclaimed past closing time. The staff, accustomed to late pickups, grew increasingly concerned as hours ticked by with no sign of Toby's owners. Deciding to contact them directly, they unearthed a detail that turned their worry into outright dread. Upon discovering why Toby had been abandoned, the employees could hardly believe the truth staring back at them. It was after closing time, and Toby still hadn't been picked up. Late pickups happened often, but by the time the evening shadows grew long and deep, a blanket of unease had settled over the centre. They decided it was time to dig deeper into Toby's records. Mara, the evening manager, pulled up Toby's file on the old desktop computer, clunking away in the corner of their office. "There's got to be something here," she muttered, browsing through the contact details. Her eyes widened as she hit upon a series of notes added just last week, cryptic and urgent, hinting at a sudden change in the owner's circumstances. She called over her colleague. "Luis, you need to see this." Luis read the notes, his brow furrowing with worry. "It says here to contact Agent Reynolds at this number if there's any issue," he said, pointing at a hastily scribbled note at the bottom of the page. "Agent? What's all this about?" Neither he nor Mara could guess why federal agents would be involved with Toby's owners. They decided to make the call. The phone rang longer than Mara had expected, each dial tone heavy with the weight of their growing dread. Finally, a voice answered, clipped and formal. "Agent Reynolds speaking." Mara explained the situation, her voice trembling slightly, noticing Luis's anxious gaze. The line went silent for a moment too long before Reynolds replied. "Keep the dog safe and don't let him out of your sight," Reynolds instructed sternly, then promptly hung up. The weight of responsibility pressed down on Mara and Luis. What had they stumbled into? They looked at each other, their expressions a mix of fear and confusion, then at Toby, who wagged his tail happily, oblivious to the situation. As night deepened, Mara and Luis took turns watching Toby, neither willing to leave him alone in the kennel. They set up a makeshift bed in the office, and Toby curled up comfortably, unaware of the tension around him. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the trees and tapping a beat against the windows. They stared out into the darkness, a sense of foreboding settling in the silence. Mara jumped as her phone vibrated suddenly, breaking the silence of the night. An unknown number flashed on the screen. Hesitating, she answered, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hello?" The line crackled, and a voice spoke rapidly. "You don't know me, but Toby is in danger. You need to protect him. They are coming." They spent the rest of the night peering through the blinds, jumping at every shadow and every sound. Mara clutched a baseball bat, while Luis kept his phone close, ready to dial 911. Toby, sensing their distress, stayed close, his ears perked up and his eyes alert. The hours crept by, each minute stretching out endlessly. Neither of them had a wink of sleep. As dawn broke, the tension had not eased. The mysterious caller had not called back, and Agent Reynolds was unreachable. Questions swirled in Mara's mind. Who was after Toby? Why was he so important? Their ordinary Tuesday had spiraled into a scary adventure they were wholly unprepared for. By morning, the local police arrived, prompted by Luis's cautious call about a potential threat. After explaining the situation, including the cryptic phone calls and Agent Reynolds' stern warning, the officers agreed to patrol the area. They advised Mara and Luis to keep their doors locked and report anything out of the ordinary. As the police car drove away, the sense of danger lingered in the silence. Mara tossed a bright red ball across the room, hoping it would lighten the mood. "Come on, Toby," she called, trying to sound cheerful. Toby bounded after it, tail wagging wildly. Luis watched them play, forcing a smile. It was a clumsy attempt to forget the uneasy silence that hung over them since the police left. The tension remained thick, But Toby's joyful leaps offered brief moments of relief. Despite their efforts to keep things light, Toby's attention often shifted. Mid-fetch, he would stop, ears perked, gazing intently towards the window. His behaviour unsettled Mara. Each time, she'd coax him back, tossing the ball with a bit more enthusiasm. "Good boy, Toby," she would say, her voice slightly strained. Luis kept his eyes fixed outside, watching for what might have caught Toby's alert gaze. Every interruption seemed to stretch longer as Toby's distractions became more frequent. Mara's voice grew firmer with each call. "Toby, here boy," she'd say, patting her leg. Toby, sensing the change in her tone, would trot back, dropping the ball at her feet before his attention drifted again. Their play was a fragile veneer over the creeping dread that something was terribly wrong. As they continued to play, Luis never turned away from the window. His watch was relentless, eyes scanning for any sign of the unknown threat. Mara noticed his unease and doubled her efforts with Toby, throwing the ball further each time, trying to keep both their spirits up. "We'll be okay, boy," she muttered under her breath, hoping it was true. The distant wail of police sirens pierced the afternoon calm, snapping them back to the grim reality of their situation. Toby paused, head tilted, listening. The sound seemed to echo their own fears, reminding them that the threat was still out there, just beyond their sight. Mara forced a smile and threw the ball again, her heart heavy. "Just a bit longer, Toby," she said, watching him run. Hours had passed in uneasy silence when a sharp knock shattered the calm. Mara and Luis jumped, eyes locking in shared alarm. "Who could that be?" Luis whispered, his voice a mix of fear and confusion. Toby, sensing their tension, let out a soft whine and nudged closer to Mara, who absently stroked his head while keeping her gaze fixed on the door. Luis crept to the door, his movements slow and deliberate. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice barely above a murmur. The response was muffled through the thick wood, making Luis press his ear against the door. Mara stood behind him, holding her breath, clutching the baseball bat a bit tighter. Toby sat down, his ears perked, mirroring the tense anticipation hanging in the air. The voice through the door finally became clear. "It's Officer Daniels," came the reply, firm and reassuring. Luis's shoulders dropped slightly, a silent sigh of relief escaping him as he unlocked the door. The familiar face of the police officer they had talked to earlier greeted them. "Sorry to startle you," Officer Daniels said, stepping into the threshold with a nod. Relief swept through the room as Officer Daniels entered. His presence seemed to push back the looming shadows of fear, at least for the moment. "Good to see you safe," he said, scanning the room and nodding at Toby, who wagged his tail cautiously. Mara managed a small smile, the tension easing momentarily from her features as she put down the bat. Officer Daniels's expression was serious as he glanced around the daycare. "Let's talk in the office," he suggested, gesturing towards the small room they used for paperwork. His tone left no room for argument, and it was clear this was more than a casual check-in. Mara and Luis exchanged a look, their brief spell of relief fading as they followed him, bracing for what was next. Around the break table, Mara, Luis, and Officer Daniels clutched steaming mugs of coffee, the warmth a small comfort in the cold, tense room. They sat in a rough circle, the steam rising in slow spirals, momentarily fogging the air between them. Each sip seemed to bolster a bit of courage as they prepared for the discussion, the room filled with the sharp scent of brewed coffee. Officer Daniels began with straightforward questions. "How long has Toby been with you? Any recent visitors or calls that seemed out of the ordinary?" he asked, his pen poised over his notebook. Mara and Luis exchanged a glance, recounting the usual days at the daycare, trying to remember any detail that might help. Toby lay by their feet, his presence a silent support. As Officer Daniels scribbled notes, he looked up briefly. "We got a call from a special agent regarding Toby," he mentioned casually, trying to gauge their reaction. The mention of the agent made Mara's hand tighten around her coffee mug. Luis leaned forward, curiosity and concern etching his features, as they both wondered how deep this situation might go. Luis recounted the late-night call that had warned them of danger. The caller was frantic, insisting Toby was in immediate danger, he explained, his voice steady, but his hands betraying a slight tremor. Officer Daniels listened intently, his pen flying across the page, capturing every word. Mara watched, her face pale, as the reality of their situation sunk in deeper. With the initial questions out of the way, Officer Daniels closed his notebook and looked at Mara and Luis seriously. "I need to share some findings from our patrol around the neighborhood," he began, his voice lowering slightly. The room grew tense, their brief respite fading as they braced for what might come next, the earlier comfort of the coffee long forgotten. Officer Daniels leaned back slightly, his expression somber. "Our patrol turned up no suspicious activity in the area," he reported. Yet, his furrowed brow betrayed his concern. "However, something doesn't feel right," he added, glancing at Mara and Luis. They nodded, the ambiguity of the situation hanging heavy in the air, their anxiety simmering just beneath the surface as they absorbed the news. "The owner's home was searched this morning," Daniels continued, shifting in his chair. "We found it completely deserted, furniture covered with dust sheets as if left in a hurry." Mara's eyes widened slightly, and Luis shifted uncomfortably. The description painted a picture of a life interrupted, the sudden emptiness adding a haunting dimension to their predicament. Daniels paused, choosing his words carefully. "There were no signs of a forced departure or struggle in the house. It's as if they planned to return but never did," he explained. The stillness of the abandoned home seemed to echo through their conversation, casting a chill over the room. Mara and Luis exchanged a glance, the mystery deepening with each detail. As they listened to the officer, Mara felt a strange mixture of relief and dread. No direct threat was detected, yet the questions and unknowns multiplied. Luis rubbed his chin thoughtfully, his mind racing with the implications of the empty house and the mysterious disappearance. They both felt the weight of the unresolved situation, unsure of what might come next. Concluding his report, Officer Daniels stood, his face serious. "Keep vigilant and report anything, no matter how minor it seems," he advised sternly. He moved towards the door, his departure casting a heavy silence over the room. Mara and Luis felt the echo of his words deep in their bones, the atmosphere thick with unspoken concerns as the door closed behind him. After the officer's departure, Mara and Luis remained seated, the weight of his suspicious gaze still lingering in the room. They felt unfairly judged, their innocence questioned without a word. Each silent accusation seemed to echo off the walls, and they looked at each other, reaffirming their own truth without speaking. Toby, sensing their discomfort, nudged his nose into Luis's hand, seeking reassurance. The barrage of questions from Officer Daniels replayed in their minds, each one probing deeper, each one more unsettling than the last. "How well did you know the owners? Any unusual visits?" Mara paced slowly by the window, trying to shake off the feeling of being analysed, while Luis sat, tapping his fingers against the table, each tap echoing the officer's persistent inquiries. Despite knowing they had done nothing wrong, Mara and Luis couldn't help feeling exposed. The interrogation had stripped away their sense of security, leaving them raw and vulnerable under the scrutinizing eye of the law. They moved around the daycare, straightening up toys and cleaning surfaces, trying to reclaim some sense of normalcy in their suddenly upturned world. With every answer they had provided, it seemed the officer's skepticism only deepened. His notes became more detailed, his questions more pointed. Luis recalled how Daniels's pen had paused dramatically at certain answers, his eyes narrowing slightly. Mara watched Luis recount this, frowning slightly as she folded a stack of clean towels, the mundane task a contrast to their troubled thoughts. The truth was on their side, yet Officer Daniels's evident skepticism planted uncomfortable seeds of doubt. Could there be more to Toby's story that even they didn't know? Mara stopped her chores, leaning against the counter, her mind racing with possibilities. Luis looked over at her, catching her eye, and gave a small, reassuring nod, trying to dispel the growing unease. In the heavy silence following the officer's exit, Mara and Luis stood in the middle of the daycare, contemplating their next move. "Should we call Agent Reynolds again?" Mara asked, biting her lip. Luis nodded, pacing a little, his worry evident. Just as they agreed to reach out, Mara's phone, resting on the corner desk, vibrated loudly against the quiet backdrop, startling them both. Mara's phone erupted into life, its shrill ring slicing through the stillness. The sudden noise made them both jump, the timing too perfect, too ominous. Luis stopped mid-step, turning towards Mara, who stared at the vibrating device as if it were a grenade about to explode. "You think it's him?" Luis asked, his voice low, as Mara reached hesitantly for the phone. Luis and Mara exchanged a look of dread as Mara's hand trembled slightly while reaching for the ringing phone. "What if it's bad news?" Mara whispered, her voice barely audible over the ringtone. Luis's eyes were fixed on her, his expression tense as he prepared himself for whatever might come through the line. Mara inhaled deeply and answered, bracing herself for the caller's identity. "It's Agent Reynolds," Mara sighed, relief and apprehension mixing in her shaky voice. Luis leaned in, trying to catch bits of the conversation. Mara's grip tightened on the phone, her other hand clenching into a fist at her side. She nodded while listening, her eyes widening with every word. "Yes, we're alone," she responded, her voice steadying gradually as she spoke. The call from Agent Reynolds was brief but filled with urgency. "Keep your guard up and don't trust anyone easily," he instructed firmly. Mara nodded, absorbing his words, feeling the weight of their implication. As she hung up, she relayed his message to Luis, who frowned, his mind racing with the possible layers of intrigue Reynolds hinted at but didn't disclose. "What are we missing?" he murmured. Agent Reynolds' voice was terse and low, his words clipped with urgency. "Has the police presence cleared from the area?" he asked. Mara, holding the phone tightly, nodded to Luis even though Reynolds couldn't see. "Yes, they've left," she whispered back, her voice mirroring the secrecy implied by Reynolds' tone. There was a pause, then a deep breath from Reynolds as he prepared to continue. "Okay, listen carefully," Reynolds continued, his voice still low. Mara pressed the phone closer to her ear, catching every word. "Toby is part of something much larger than you know," he hinted, his words heavy with implications. Mara felt a chill run down her spine as she absorbed his words. Luis stood nearby, trying to make sense of the fragmented conversation he could overhear. Reynolds' next words took both Mara and Luis by surprise. "I need your help to reunite Toby with his family, who are currently unreachable," he said. His proposition was unexpected and serious, cloaked in mystery. Mara and Luis exchanged a glance, uncertainty flickering between them. The task sounded daunting, but their concern for Toby nudged them towards agreement. Driven by a mix of fear and a genuine desire to help Toby, Mara and Luis agreed to Reynolds' plan. They didn't fully understand what they were getting into, but the thought of helping Toby find his family gave them a sense of purpose. "We'll do what we can," Mara said firmly, Luis nodding in agreement beside her, both aware of the risks but compelled to act. "Follow my instructions precisely, no deviations," Reynolds instructed. "Your role is crucial." His directions were clear but perilously vague, leaving Mara and Luis with more questions than answers. They committed to the task despite the uncertainty clouding their minds. As the call ended, they felt the weight of responsibility settle on their shoulders, aware that their actions could have far-reaching consequences. Reynolds' instructions were clear and urgent. "Delete all records of Toby's stay. Every file, every mention, he directed. Mara and Luis hurried to the office computer, their fingers flying over the keyboard as they permanently erased Toby's files from the Daycare system. They were erasing more than just data. It felt like they were wiping away a part of their recent past, each click deepening the mystery. Next, Reynolds gave them a new task. "Transport Toby to this address," he said, providing details only after making sure they were alone. "Keep him in sight at all times. The stakes couldn't be higher," he emphasized. Mara wrote down the address with a trembling hand, while Luis readied Toby's leash, his actions deliberate, aware of the weight of their responsibility. "The most important thing," Reynolds' voice crackled over the phone, "is that you never lose sight of Toby, not even for a second." His urgency was palpable, infecting Mara and Luis with a heightened sense of alertness. They nodded to each other, understanding the gravity of this admonition as they adjusted Toby's harness, ensuring it was secure and comfortable for him. As they prepared for their journey, Mara and Luis's anxiety mounted. They gathered necessary supplies, water for Toby, a map of the area, and some snacks for themselves, all the while discussing Reynolds's dire warnings in low voices. Each item packed felt like a step deeper into uncharted territory, their apprehension growing with the realization of how much they were venturing into the unknown. With Toby securely leashed and their bag packed, Mara and Luis stepped out of the daycare into the early morning light. Toby, sensing the unusual activity, stayed close to their legs, his tail wagging cautiously. As they locked the daycare behind them and headed to their car, their minds raced with scenarios of what might await them at the address Reynolds had given. The drive was fraught with tension. Mara and Luis were hyper-alert, scanning the streets and mirrors for any sign of police or mysterious followers. Luis gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white, while Mara kept her eyes fixed on the rearview mirror, watching every car that turned behind them. Toby sat quietly in the back, sensing the unease but calm in his spot. As they approached the city outskirts, an abandoned warehouse loomed ahead, its dilapidated exterior a stark reminder of their isolation. The building, surrounded by overgrown weeds and graffiti-covered walls, stood ominously against the grey sky. Mara swallowed hard, her apprehension growing as they neared their destination, the desolation of the place mirroring their feelings of solitude and uncertainty. They parked the car discreetly behind the warehouse, using an old shipping container for cover. With every heartbeat, Mara and Luis surveyed the area intently for any signs they were being watched. The silence was oppressive, only the occasional distant sound of traffic breaking it. They sat in silence, their breaths shallow, each movement outside catching their attention. With Toby's leash securely in hand, Mara and Luis maintained a vigilant watch over their surroundings. Every sound made them tense, ready to react to any sign of danger. Luis adjusted the rearview mirror to give them a broader view, while Mara kept her eyes on the warehouse's entrances. Toby, feeling their tension, stayed unusually quiet, his ears perking up at the smallest noises. The eerie silence of the warehouse was in stark contrast to the chaos of their thoughts. Each creak and rustle of wind through the broken windows made them jump, their minds imagining scenarios of confrontation. Mara and Luis exchanged nervous glances, trying to reassure each other with a tight squeeze of hands, the stillness around them amplifying their fears of what was to come. After an agonizing wait, a nondescript car appeared in the distance, its approach slow and calculated. Mara gripped Luis's hand as they watched the vehicle maneuver carefully toward them, its movements deliberate under the grey, overcast sky. They held their breath, every detail of the car etching into their memory as it finally came to a halt a few feet away from them. The car window rolled down slowly, revealing a man with a stern expression that seemed to match the gruffness of his voice. He surveyed Mara and Luis with a piercing gaze that seemed to look right through them. The silence stretched on as they waited for him to speak, the sound of the wind whistling softly through the abandoned warehouse. "Mara and Luis?" he asked sharply, his voice cutting through the tense air. Mara nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, that's us." The man's eyes lingered on them for a moment longer, assessing their sincerity, his gaze intense and probing. The atmosphere was thick with tension, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. Introductions were brief. The man confirmed he was Agent Reynolds. "Get in the car, quickly," he instructed without any preamble, his tone leaving no room for hesitation. Mara and Luis exchanged a quick look, a silent agreement passing between them before they gathered Toby and their belongings, moving toward the car with a mix of trepidation and urgency. Inside the car, Agent Reynolds' demeanor was all business. "Let me see Toby," he demanded, his voice firm. Mara carefully revealed Toby, who had been hidden under a blanket for safety. Reynolds' gaze softened momentarily as he looked at the dog, a flicker of something gentler passing over his features before he masked it with his usual sternness, ready to move on. With Toby safely in the car, Agent Reynolds wasted no time. The vehicle sped away, quickly leaving the dim outlines of the city behind. Mara and Luis felt the rush of the speeding car, each turn and acceleration pushing them further from the life they knew. The landscape blurred past the windows, cityscapes giving way to open roads as they ventured into unknown territory. As they drove, Reynolds began to share more. "Toby's owners are under witness protection," he revealed, glancing in the rearview mirror. They were targeted due to their influential connections. Mara and Luis absorbed every word, the reality of the situation sinking in. The road ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, mirroring the depth of the new reality they were being drawn into. Reynolds continued, "They had to leave suddenly and couldn't secure Toby in time." His voice was steady, eyes fixed on the road. His safety was compromised by the threats they faced. Mara and Luis exchanged a glance, understanding now the gravity of what had been at stake. The weight of their mission felt heavier with each mile they covered. Mara and Luis listened, overwhelmed by the enormity of what they had become entangled in. The casual workday at the daycare had spiraled into a critical, life-altering saga. "We're really in this, aren't we?" Luis muttered under his breath. Mara nodded, squeezing his hand, both coming to terms with the pivotal role they now played in safeguarding Toby. The journey culminated at a discreet safe house nestled in a secluded area. As they approached, Toby's excitement grew. Upon entering, his owners, faces lined with worry, lit up with joy. The reunion was heartfelt, Toby bounding into their arms, his tail wagging furiously. Mara and Luis stepped back, watching the emotional scene unfold, a palpable sense of relief washing over everyone.